So what I'd like to do now is introduce briefly our next speaker, Dr. James J. James. He's going to tell you a little bit more about himself, and we may be interrupted at any point in time, and here's how the interruption will work. If the congressman comes while he's here, the congressman will wait till he's done before his panelists come. So that may happen at any moment. And unless he comes before we actually have him start, he'll be starting momentarily. Come on up here tonight. Dr. James J. James is interesting. Many of our folks who are involved with the MP6 advisory panel for the medical industry know him well. If you've been involved in the American Medical Association, he has a long history of involvement. He will give you a little bit more about that, but I thought I'd make it applicable to what we're doing. As you know, Infragard is just 20 years old, the MP6 is just 5 years old. And a lot of the things that we're doing of the groundbreaking nature have not really been done by others you might think could have done it. And the American Medical Association has not always put as much emphasis, from what I understand, to the disaster medicine community, and even to a lot of the public health community. And so many of the top people in the country who represent disaster medicine and public health have formed a group of their own called the Society for Disaster Medicine and Public Health that he founded and he chaired, and just from brute force, imagination, and no money, I assume, and no budget. Anybody familiar with that problem? So how do you start something from nothing, and the problems that you're addressing are some of the largest in society? So you'd think that the largest problems that face us would be managed by the people with the most money, but it's not usually the way it works. So we have a very much kindred spirit here, and Dr. Terry Donant will be on the next panel and so on. We worked together this past July, actually, to put a tabletop exercise workshop together based on the triple threat work many of you contributed to last year. So we think in the same way that we're working with the Protective Security Advisory Program at DHS, we would like to also integrate more thoroughly with his society. And in the conference proceedings you have, in the back you'll see an overview of the society, and you'll see a paper that he had jointly published that will give you a background on him and his society. So I expect that you're all going to read it. There will be a quiz in the morning for all of you who see me next door Saturday for breakfast. And with no further elaboration, I'd like to welcome Dr. James J. James.
Thank you, Chuck. And he made a couple of mistakes. He got the name almost right, James J. James, but he got it backwards. couldn't resist. I know. Anyway, I know the congressman is coming, and I do an awful lot of talks, but I do it to such disparate groups. I never quite know what to prepare. I've got some slides. I'm going to run through them quickly, especially the first half, because I want to get to the second half. I think the one message that came through from just about everybody this morning is you've got all these great speakers speaking to the choir. And myself and Terry Donant we're talking about that. And how do you get to the message? How do you get the message to the people who need to hear it? More importantly, how do you get the message to them and have them act upon it? And our society, Disaster Medicine and Public Health, we look at EMP, we look at electric grids, we look at outage, but we look at the whole spectrum of disasters. And it's a terribly, terribly broad spectrum. And the problems, regardless of what event you're talking about, seem to run through it. And that is getting the resources to do the job you know needs to be done, and finding the leaders in the private sector who will pick up the thing. And it's just extremely challenging, and I'll leave it at that. So, let me run through the first set of slides, or I shouldn't even say set, it's maybe 8 or 10 slides, tend to be basic in terms of disaster medicine, what we're about, what we try to accomplish, how we try to accomplish. But the second part of it is the piece that, I think you need to pay attention to in terms of how do we communicate with leadership. Now, I'm healthcare, so I'm focused on the hospital and medical community. You're focused on all of those other sectors, including health. But my remarks are mainly within that sector. Most people look at this and they go, oh boy, another story about 9/11. This poster actually appeared in the New York Times, I think it was 1962 or 1963. And why it appeared is a group of businessmen decided that the trade towers, which were on the drawing board at that time and had been approved, would be a disaster potentially, especially for commercial aviation. And this poster became the poster child for that group and almost led to the cancellation of the towers. But the important thing is the individuals building the tower paid attention to it, and they tried to make structural changes that would allow the towers to withstand this impact. And they probably would have, but what changed? Technology. The size of the plane, the amount of gasoline in the plane that hit. So the thing is, you can't prepare for everything. And I think too often we try to do 100% preventive preparation, when if maybe we picked a 60% or a 70% or a doable level, we'd at least get started. This is just timeline of disasters. It's a little bit outdated right now, but the line continues up, up, and away. And we're going to see that continue. That's just another depiction of it. This is the reason we're going to see it continue. Even if you had the same number of naturally occurring disasters, the impact on human populations is going to go up exponentially because that's what's happening with the population. And as the population increases, food becomes scarce. Where do people live? They live in coastal areas. They live on the beach. They live near the water. And that's a continuing trend. And until population tapers off, I don't think you're going to see any tapering off of disasters. The other important thing is population impacts on every single node there. And those are the nodes that we're concerned with in terms of changes in the environment, the physical, biological, etc. This is just a representation of cities at risk of natural disasters, nothing to do with nuclear, nothing to do with EMP. And the numbers to the right are not probability kinds of things. Those are the populations in millions that are going to be potentially affected by a mega disaster. Tokyo, Yokohama, the planners there are convinced within the next 10 years they're going to have a mega earthquake that's going to affect those areas. This is what we're all about, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. I know it's basic. The folks in this room are mainly concerned with one part of that, and that's the mitigation and preparedness phase. I'm a firm believer every one of us needs to be concerned about all aspects of the disaster cycle. I'm going to have a little help here as I go along from Shakespeare, and we really need to have the wheel come full circle. Preparedness, we need information updated, we need to make a plan. You've got to put resources in place, but they have to be dual use. And I think as you all get started, as we have a new administration, supposedly a big increase in infrastructure planning, we really need to build ourselves into it, not just for electric grids and EMP, but for all of the natural disasters that we can too easily predict. Better 3 hours too soon than a minute too late. Response, early warning, sounds good, difficult to do. Tsunami hits Japan. It travels 500 miles an hour and usually occurs within a 250-mile radius. So early detection is good, but not always possible. One of the things we don't do when something happens is a thorough assessment, so we don't end up doing the right thing. An overflow of good converts to bad. In Badiachi, right after the tsunami, the beach was littered with wheelchairs. The beach. Some organization had all these wheelchairs they sent over to Banda Aceh, which lost 80% of its population. You couldn't even roll them in the sand. Recovery, short-term, long-term. New Orleans is still recovering. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Not enough to help the people up, but to support them. The response phase gets all of the attention. The EMT, the search and rescue, etc. They run in, they do a job for a week or two, do it extremely well, and then they leave. Well, the problems, the real problems, are just beginning. Mitigation, and again, that's where, I think the biggest impact of this group and your efforts and policies go towards. And of course, the biggest problem is we build on the past. The past is the prologue to everything we do. And one of the examples here, and underscoring you can't prepare for everything, the great tsunami that hit Japan several years ago and ended up with the power outages and the nuclear plants, etc. Why weren't they better prepared? They had a seawall in place that should have handled about 99% of tsunamis by historical experience. That particular tsunami was a little bigger than what their maximum plan was. So again, without that seawall in place, think of how even greater the devastation might have been. This is our vision. I'm sure it reflects the philosophy of many of the people here. And the word I was so happy to hear so often this morning from the speakers is resilience. Now, you were talking about community resilience and centers of resilience. I also feel very strongly we need to look at individual resilience. If you don't have individuals that are resilient, it's hard to envision a truly resilient community. In the end, we want to end up with people who are ready, willing, and able. Too much of our attention has been placed on first responders. Do you realize it's your fellow citizen, your neighbor, your family member who's responsible for more than 50% of retrievals in a major event for saving life and limb? Does that mean EMT is unimportant? Absolutely not. But it does mean we need to refocus more attention on our neighbors, on the public. This is our publication. We don't write books. We have a professional journal, Disaster Medicine and Public Health. I'm going to leave a few copies up here if anybody wants to peruse it. We cover the whole spectrum, and we've had articles on microgrids and new technologies and power requirements in the field, etc. So it's not as if our community has ignored what you're doing in the past, but it's only been since I've been working with Chuck and Terry that, the magnitude of what we're looking at as a healthcare disaster has really become apparent. Those photos were taken off the coast of Japan as the tsunami came in. And that was 4 photos taken by a single photographer who happened to be a physician from the Medical Society of Japan. And anyway, so we use that for our cover. Now, here's the part, and I'm going to turn a little because I want to be able to read. Whoops, did I lose it? No. In terms of communicating to leaders, what happened in the past couple of years that got more attention from our leaders than anything else in the healthcare field? Ebola. A real life-threatening event for most Americans. We spent literally billions of dollars on a non-problem. And I don't mean that off the cuff, that it didn't have to be addressed. We didn't have to take measures to protect against it. We didn't have to support what was going on in West Africa, where it really was a devastating problem. But there was no way you were going to have an outbreak, an epidemic of Ebola in the United States. And yet we were basically throwing people in prison. We called it, my mind slips on the word sometimes, but quarantine. There you go, quarantine. You know, they used to do quarantine back in the plague years. They had the militia from the Brits around the plague houses, and they were armed, and you didn't leave your house. So our quarantine's not quite that bad. But all I'm saying is we spent an awful lot of resource on a threat that was much more political than it was practical. Anyway, to get to leaders, you've got to get emotion. And what happened with Ebola is everybody got emotional about it. Everyone believed it. Everyone was afraid. And I believe if you all are going to be successful communicating to leadership, you've got to get the message across of how serious a problem power failure is. I don't care if it's EMP. I don't care if it's a space storm or a nuclear or whatever. What I think you need to focus on when you're dealing with the healthcare industry is power failure and the effects and potential effects of power failure. People come back at me and go, oh, well, we plan for that all the time. Yeah, you plan for 3 days. That's the requirement from JACO. And that means 3 days of fuel for a diesel generator. And you don't even have to have the fuel on hand. You can have a contract with the local gas station to deliver that instantly. You all know in a true EMP event, all of that goes out the window. The other thing, historically, they'll throw back at you, well, we'll evacuate. Well, in your scenario, there is no evacuation because there's no place to evacuate to, even if you could accomplish it. We did our exercise in July on this, and after Terry finished and we were closing it out, one of the pundits in the room said, well, this is ridiculous because it will never happen. It can't happen. The probability is way too low. And we were talking about electric outage, not EMP, all right? Well, guess what? There's a living example in the United States called Katrina as to what the impact of long-term electric outage is on a healthcare system. And I'm just going to run through it briefly, but I think this is a message that healthcare leadership needs to hear. August 28th, mandatory evacuation. Unfortunately, there was no mandatory evacuation of hospitals and nursing homes. Superdome became the refuge of last resort. Patients were still being admitted to the hospitals while the rest of New Orleans was being evacuated. That 2,000 people, that was 2,000 people inside Memorial Hospital, which we're going to talk about, who were there because they knew a hospital had power supply and food supply, etc. So in addition to a couple of hundred patients, you had 2,000 people, family members, etc., including pets, who were using that hospital for what you were talking about this morning, which is a residence center. August 29th, the next day, landfall, 135 miles. I don't know if you've ever been in a wind of 80, 90 miles. You can't stand up, let alone when you're starting to get up around 135. Hospital was on generator power. Wow, that's good. Except generator power varies from hospital to hospital. The main requirement is to keep the ER going, that it keep the ICUs going, it keep the respirators going, it keep the critical care areas going. Does it keep the air conditioning going? Does it keep the heating systems going? Not necessarily. These people ended up working in 120 degrees within the hospital. Also, the hurricane warning came on a Sunday. This is a Monday. What do you think hospital staffing is early on a Monday morning? It was bare bones. Nobody came in. In fact, half the staff went home from this one hospital. So you got one small group of medical providers who decided, you know, their duty, their responsibility was to those patients in that hospital at that time. By Tuesday, August 30th, everything was underwater and they began to triage. Triage under the most extreme conditions. Generators failed. What does that mean? You're working in the dark. You're taking care of critical ill patients whose electrical support systems are no longer in place. You're doing it in the dark, and you're doing it on 36 hours sleep. Or, I'm sorry, wish they had 36 hours. 36 hours without, I think I'm suffering without sleep. Anyway, so reverse triage. What's reverse triage? It means you do what you can to get the sickest people out initially. That's the first thing you do. This later goes back into regular triage where you have to do the most for the least. I'll run it quickly here, Chuck. I'm sorry, that one didn't show up very well. This would show you the inside of what we're talking about, and believe me, it's like a third world country.
It's perfect, it's in the dark.
You're right. We couldn't get the picture, it was in the dark. Thank you. Oh, never mind, never mind. I hate slides like this. Anyway, inside, no electricity, no running water. The only communication was verbal and a few walkie-talkies. Temperature over 105 degrees, limited supply, food and water, and no security. No plan for hospital evacuation. Wouldn't matter anyway. Like I said, there was no place to evacuate them to. This was what was going on outside the hospital. And it was actually a lawless zone. August 31st, a couple of days later, the philosophy was basically save yourself throughout New Orleans. They had a massive movement of patients to common loading sites. They carried them, 2 or 3 people per patient down to these loading sites, putting them on boats to go to areas where hopefully they could be helicoptered out or they would get them to the airport. One of the hospitals was using this drive-up thing where they used the garage and were able to operate cars and get people up to the 8th floor where helicopters were able to come in. The hospital conditions, if you know what a special needs shelter is, that is something that is basically nursing support. It's not medical support. In this case, it was hospice. This was hospice support at this point in this hospital with 100 and some patients. And this is the scene I was mumbling about before, which I thought was that other slide. And you can see this is not the kind of medical care you expect in your local community hospital. FEMA arrived 3 days later. They got rid of the airboats. There's good and bad to that. People, however, still would not evacuate without pets. You talk about other communities that you have to get into. Don't forget the veterinary community. People do not move without pets. Patients died. And the sad part is many of those patients should not have died. They weren't in, many of them were in that hospital for elective procedures or conditions that should have a fairly high probability of responding positively to. Certainly should have left the hospital. Many died, they were investigated. I'm not going to go into that aspect of the whole thing. Problems. Hospitals and nursing homes are not required to evacuate, and they were used as shelters. That has changed since then. with requirements to have evacuation plans. Hospital was ill-prepared. Of course, the resources were overwhelmed. Remember, there were 2,000 additional people using those resources. Lack of generator power. Generators were great for 2 or 3 days, or 2 days in this case, but there was no way to refuel them. Mass casualty and triage. This is great in a wartime environment. What we saw in New Orleans, however, was not a war. There is a duty to care. How long is the physician and the nurse expected to stay with dying patients, especially after they've been up continuously without sleep, going on 3 days, a skeleton staff? What do you do with patients who cannot be evacuated? That was probably the toughest ethical question. And that's one that every hospital executive needs to be able to face, given an EMP type of event. Hope turns to anguish, especially in the intensive care unit. Did you ever try? Well, I know you didn't, you're not medical, but trying to keep a patient going who needs intensive care without support systems is physically demanding, to say the least. There was no good solution. There were only bad choices. And that's the way New Orleans was in reality when they had power, a loss of power for a prolonged period of time. This was not New Orleans. This was New York Medical Center during Sandy. You can't see it very well, but what they're doing is evacuating a patient by hand down the stairs. And every once in a while, you got a 400-pound patient and 2 people on a litter going down stairs in the dark. And that's reality. And that's what an EMP will result in. Legal actions came later. We're all afraid to do the right thing anymore because we're going to be sued. And that's another aspect that's beyond what we're here today about, just one of my thoughts. This is just a parting comment. Ray Swinton was actually supposed to be here today, but I had to cancel the meeting we had for yesterday, and he didn't make it. But the future rests on us not allowing complacency to take hold. And that's what we need to overcome. And you're not going to overcome it with technical facts.